Hi, my name is Mike Lewin and I'm running for Manhattan Bureau President. So as those of you who've seen my other videos know, my core message is that we need to loosen or even eliminate zoning laws in order to allow much more housing to be constructed. So one counter argument is, why do we need market rate housing? Why not just build more public housing? After all, public housing is more affordable, and certainly the poor people, or at least people who can't afford market rate housing, are needier than the people who can't afford it, right? Well, this argument really presupposes a false dichotomy that public housing gets in the way of private housing or vice versa. But I don't think that needs to be the case. Certainly, I don't think private housing gets in the way of public housing. Why not? Well, it seems to me actually private housing facilitates public housing in a couple of ways. First, to the extent we're actually able to hold rents down, which I think we could if we really allowed unlimited quantities of private housing, then there would be less demand for public housing, which means it will be less expensive to build whatever amount of public housing we think we need. Second, more construction means more tax revenue for the city and more economic activity generally. So that in turn would make it easier for the city to fund at least renovations to existing public housing and maybe even additional public housing. Finally, I think people who imagine public housing is really addressing our entire housing shortage, really don't realize how hard it's going to be to build public housing. First of all, with whose money are you going to do this? Who's going to be willing to pay higher taxes for it? New York City already has, certainly for income taxes, I suspect it has the highest taxes of any city in the nation. And I don't think there's much appetite for a huge tax increase. Similarly, who's going to want public housing near their neighborhood? We like to think that people's objections to new housing is really just only against high-priced housing, that people would be absolutely just bonkers with joy to have quote-unquote affordable housing within their neighborhood. But the truth is, the kind of not in my backyard resistance to new housing is, I don't want to say it's just as frequent for affordable housing, because I don't think there's any way to prove or disprove that. But certainly, I've seen examples of objections to quote-unquote affordable housing, as well as objections to not so affordable housing. So I suspect if we build large amounts of public housing, we're going to run into exactly the same buzzsaw of community resistance that we do for private housing. So if we are going to build more public housing, we really need to change the procedural rules, which means essentially the city would have to be able to build public housing without years of community input. So all of which is to say, public housing is not necessarily a bad thing. The truth is, even if we bring rents down to, say, Atlanta levels, there's still going to be people who can't afford to pay them. And so we still need to address that in some way. But I think market rate housing is not only an important part of the equation, but also actually would make it easier to build public housing. So on that note, see you on the campaign trail.